Mara Voss had worked the Stormhaven backcountry for 6 seasons, and in all that time she had never once needed her radio for anything beyond a twisted ankle or a lost tourist. The ridge sat at the northern edge of the national forest, a long spine of gray rock that locals called the Old Wall because it ran for nearly 9 miles without a single break wide enough to drive a truck through. Mara liked the solitude of the place. She liked the way the wind moved through the high pines like something breathing, and she liked that her station, a small cabin built from logs cut 2 generations earlier, sat far enough from the nearest town that she could go 3 or 4 days without seeing another human face. That autumn, the elk herds that normally crossed the eastern slope did not come. At first she assumed they had simply shifted their migration, as herds sometimes did after a hard winter or a dry summer. But when she hiked out to check the salt licks near Cradle Creek, she found them untouched, the grass around them tall and undisturbed, as if every animal within 5 miles had quietly decided to be somewhere else. She mentioned it to her supervisor, a man named Dale Crane who ran the regional office out of the valley town of Anders Hollow. Crane told her not to worry about it. He said herds did strange things sometimes, and that her job was trail maintenance and visitor safety, not wildlife biology. Mara accepted this, because she had no reason yet to doubt him, and because Dale Crane had never given her cause for suspicion in the 3 years she had worked under him. It was 2 weeks later that the first hiker went missing. His name was Soren Whitfield, a graduate student from the State University who had been mapping lichen growth along the northern face of the ridge. He had checked in with the ranger station on a Tuesday morning and had not checked in again. When Mara went looking for him, she found his tent still standing, his sleeping bag still zipped, and his boots still sitting neatly by the door flap, as though he had stepped out for a moment in his socks and simply never come back. The search for Soren Whitfield lasted 4 days and turned up nothing. No torn clothing, no blood, no sign of an animal attack, not even a footprint leading away from the tent in any clear direction. Mara walked the search grid herself alongside 2 volunteers from town and a tracking dog named Birch, and Birch behaved strangely the entire time. The dog would not go near a particular outcrop of rock on the northern face, a place where the granite folded in on itself and created a shadowed hollow that the search map labeled only as Site 7. Birch sat down at the edge of that hollow and refused to move, whining low in his throat until his handler finally gave up and led him away. Mara noted the location in her log but did not mention the dog's behavior to Crane. She told herself it meant nothing, that dogs sometimes smelled a den of foxes or a dead deer and reacted with simple animal aversion. But that night, lying awake in her cabin, she kept thinking about the way Birch had planted his paws and refused to take one more step toward that hollow in the rock. A week after the search ended, the county listed Soren Whitfield as a presumed accidental death, likely a fall into one of the deep crevasses that scarred the northern face. No body was ever recovered. Mara filed the paperwork and tried to move on, but the unease did not leave her. She began taking longer routes on her patrols, routes that brought her past Site 7 more often than her duties required. The tremors started in late October. They were small, barely strong enough to rattle the dishes in Mara's cabin, and the regional seismic station attributed them to minor fault activity along an old fracture line that ran beneath the ridge. But Mara noticed something the official report did not mention. The tremors always came at night, and they always came at almost exactly the same hour, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, as though they were not the random shifting of rock but something closer to a schedule. She began sleeping less. She started carrying a notebook with her on patrol, jotting down the time of each tremor, the weather, the behavior of the few animals she still saw. A pattern emerged that she could not explain. The tremors grew slightly stronger on nights when the wind blew from the north, the same direction as Site 7. One night, unable to sleep, she hiked out to the hollow with a flashlight and her service radio clipped to her belt. The air near the rock fold felt different from the surrounding forest, cooler and strangely still, as if the wind itself avoided the place. She ran her light over the granite and found nothing unusual until she crouched low and noticed a seam in the rock that did not match the natural fracture pattern around it. It was a straight line, too straight, cut at an angle no weathering process could produce. Mara returned to Site 7 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, each time bringing better equipment. On her third visit, She brought a small pry bar and a portable light rig from the station's maintenance shed. She worked at the seam in the rock for nearly an hour before a section of stone, lighter than it should have been, swung inward on a hinge disguised by decades of moss and lichen growth. Behind it was a tunnel, square cut, lined with concrete that had cracked and crumbled in places but still held its shape after what must have been many years of neglect. A draft of stale air rolled out to meet her, carrying a faint chemical smell beneath the dust, something sharp and metallic that reminded her of a hospital corridor. She stood at the threshold for a long time before she made the decision to call it in. She radioed Dale Crane that night and described what she had found, expecting him to send a team or at least express some curiosity. Instead, there was a long pause on the line, and when Crane spoke again his voice had a careful, measured quality she had not heard from him before. He told her to seal the entrance, mark the coordinates, and leave it alone until he could look into old survey records. He told her this twice, as though he wanted to be certain she understood, and something about his tone made her decide not to tell him she had already gone inside 10 feet before losing her nerve and turning back. Mara did not seal the entrance. She told herself she would, eventually, once she understood what the tunnel actually was. In the meantime, she requested old topographic surveys and land use records from the county archive, citing trail maintenance as her reason. Most of what came back was unremarkable, decades of logging permits and grazing leases, but buried in a folder of declassified federal documents from the 1960s she found a single reference to a facility called Stormhaven Station, described only as a decommissioned communications relay operated jointly by the Army Corps of Engineers and an agency whose name had been redacted with black ink so old it had begun to flake at the edges. The document gave no exact coordinates, but the surveyed boundary it described matched the northern face of the ridge almost perfectly. Mara printed the page and pinned it to the wall of her cabin beside her hand-drawn map of Site 7. She found herself staring at it most evenings, turning the words decommissioned and communications relay over in her mind, neither of which felt adequate to explain a tunnel cut deep enough into a mountain that the draft from its mouth carried the smell of machinery still running somewhere far below. 3 weeks after her first attempt, Mara went back into the tunnel properly equipped, with a headlamp, extra batteries, water, a length of rope, and a satellite messenger in case her radio lost signal underground. She told no one where she was going. She left a note in her cabin describing the entrance location, in case something happened to her, but she did not send it to Crane. The tunnel ran level for nearly 200 yards before opening into a wider chamber that had once been some kind of equipment bay. Rusted shelving lined the walls, holding crates whose markings had faded into illegible streaks of corrosion. A set of metal stairs descended from the far end of the chamber, switchbacking down into darkness her headlamp could not fully penetrate. The air grew warmer the lower she went, which struck her as wrong, since deep rock should have held a steady cold regardless of the season. At the bottom of the stairs she found a door, heavier than anything she had expected, set with a wheel lock like the hatch of a ship. Beside it, mounted on the wall, was a small panel with a single red light glowing steadily, powered by some source she could not identify. The light meant power. Power meant the place was not as decommissioned as the old document claimed. The wheel lock turned with effort, grinding against decades of disuse, but it turned. Beyond the door, Mara found a long corridor lit by emergency strips that flickered weakly along the ceiling, fed by wiring that should have failed long ago. The corridor walls were lined with rooms, most of them empty, a few still holding the bones of old furniture, metal desks and filing cabinets warped by moisture. She found what had clearly been a control room near the corridor's midpoint. Banks of equipment filled the space, much of it unfamiliar, dials and switches arranged in configurations she did not recognize from any military surplus she had seen. One console, smaller than the rest and positioned at the center of the room like a captain's chair on a ship, still displayed a faint glow on its screen. She approached it carefully and found a string of numbers scrolling slowly across the display, updating every few seconds, though she had no idea what they measured. On a shelf beside the console she found a stack of logbooks, their covers swollen with old moisture but their pages still legible. The earliest entries were dated 1964. The most recent entry, written in a hand far steadier and far more modern than the rest, was dated only 8 months earlier. The logbooks told a story that Mara read in fragments, sitting on an overturned crate with her headlamp angled down at the brittle pages. The facility had begun as exactly what the federal document described, a communications relay built during a period when the government worried about underground survivability after a nuclear strike. But somewhere in the early 70s, the mission had changed. The later entries referenced something called the Substrate Project, discussing it in clinical, detached language that made Mara's skin crawl even before she understood what it meant. The substrate, according to one entry, had been discovered during the original excavation, a deep vein of organic material embedded in the rock that did not behave like anything in known biology. It pulsed faintly with its own warmth. It responded to proximity. Early researchers had described moving it as carefully as one might move an unexploded shell, and one entry noted with what read like clinical pride that exposure produced measurable changes in tissue samples within hours. Mara closed the logbook and sat in the dim red light of the console for a long moment, trying to convince herself that she was reading the ravings of paranoid Cold War scientists rather than a literal account. But the recent entry, only 8 months old, written in clean modern handwriting, suggested otherwise. It read simply, in part, that containment integrity had dropped to 62% and that subjects 4 through 9 had stopped responding to recall signals. A sound reached her then, distant but unmistakable, a slow dragging noise that echoed faintly through the ventilation ducts above the control room. Mara switched off her headlamp on instinct and sat in the dark, listening. The dragging stopped. Then, after nearly a full minute of silence, it resumed, moving away from her rather than toward her, and she allowed herself to breathe again. She decided she had seen enough for one trip. She gathered the logbooks she had read and 2 others she had not, intending to study them at the surface where she could think clearly, away from whatever made that sound in the dark. As she made her way back toward the stairwell, her headlamp passed across a side corridor she had not noticed on her way in, and at the far end of it she saw a row of doors, each one fitted with a small reinforced window at eye level, the kind used in places designed to hold something in rather than keep something out. She did not go closer. She told herself she would come back better prepared, with more light, more time, and ideally not alone. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, sealed the upper door as best she could behind her, and did not stop walking until she reached the cold open air at the mouth of the tunnel, where the stars above Stormhaven Ridge had never looked so welcome. Back at her cabin, Mara spent 2 sleepless days reading through the logbooks she had taken. The picture that formed was worse than she had let herself imagine on the mountain. The substrate, whatever it actually was, had been treated for decades as both a scientific curiosity and a potential weapon. Researchers exposed animal subjects to it first, then, according to entries from the late 80s written in increasingly clipped and evasive language, human subjects drawn from a pool the logs only ever described as volunteers. The changes the substrate produced were not described in detail, but the language around them shifted over the decades from excitement to caution to something that read, by the most recent entries, like quiet dread. The word subjects eventually replaced any more specific terminology, and the entries stopped describing behavior in psychological terms and began describing it in purely physical ones: growth rates, tissue density, response to stimulus. Mara considered calling the state police, or the FBI, or any authority that might take such a claim seriously. But she had nothing solid to show them beyond a few water-damaged logbooks that read like science fiction. She decided she needed more, something undeniable, before she brought this to anyone outside the Park Service. She did not yet understand that the Park Service itself might already know. She went back a 3rd time 5 days later, this time telling herself firmly that she would document everything with photographs and would not go past the control room. She kept that promise for less than 20 minutes. The pull of the side corridor with its reinforced windows proved too strong, and she found herself walking toward it almost before she had decided to. The first 3 cells she checked through their small windows were empty, stripped down to bare concrete with drains set into the center of each floor. The 4th held something curled in the far corner, motionless, vaguely human in its proportions but wrong in ways her mind refused to immediately process, the limbs too long, the skin a pale gray that caught her headlamp's light like wet stone. She backed away from the window slowly, careful not to make a sound, though she suspected later that sound had nothing to do with what came next. A voice spoke from behind her, low and hoarse, asking who she was and how she had gotten in. Mara spun, her hand dropping instinctively to the pepper spray on her belt, and found herself facing a man in his 50s, gaunt, wearing a lab coat gone gray with age and grime, his eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. The man introduced himself as Holt Bennett. He told her he had been a junior researcher at the facility decades earlier and had returned, alone, after reading something in old project files that convinced him the substrate program had never actually been shut down. He said he had been living in the upper levels of the facility for nearly 3 weeks, surviving on stored rations, trying to gather proof of what the program had become. Mara wanted to trust him immediately, simply because he was another human voice in a place that had begun to feel unbearably empty, but something in his explanation did not sit right with her. He spoke about the substrate with a familiarity that seemed too easy for a man who claimed to have left the project decades ago, and his hands, she noticed, were remarkably steady for someone who claimed to have spent 3 weeks alone in a place like this. Still, he offered information she could not get anywhere else. He told her the facility had never lost full funding. He told her that a small rotating staff still maintained it, supplying the lower containment levels on an irregular schedule that he had learned to predict. He told her that the next supply rotation was due within the week, and that if she wanted proof beyond a doubt, the best chance she would ever have was to be there when it arrived. Mara and Holt spent the better part of 2 days exploring the upper levels together, and despite her lingering unease, she found herself grateful for the company. He showed her hidden stairwells that did not appear on any of the old structural drawings, storage levels containing supplies far too fresh to belong to a decommissioned facility, fuel cells, sealed rations, medical equipment with manufacturing dates from the current decade. He also showed her something that chilled her more than anything in the logbooks. A wall of monitors, dark and powered down, but wired into a working network whose cables ran somewhere deeper into the mountain than either of them had yet explored. Holt explained that the cameras fed a central observation room far below the level they currently occupied, a room he had never been able to reach because the stairwell leading to it required a keycard he did not have. Mara asked him, carefully, how he knew so much about a facility he claimed to have left so long ago. He answered easily, perhaps too easily, that some details simply stayed with a person, and that fear was a powerful teacher of memory. She let the answer stand, though she began, quietly, to keep her own notes separate from anything she shared with him. On the 3rd night since meeting Holt, Mara woke in the small storage room they had converted into a shelter to the sound of his voice, low and urgent, coming from the corridor outside. She lay still and listened. He was speaking into a radio, a model far more modern than anything she had seen in the facility's old equipment stores, and his tone bore none of the frightened uncertainty he had shown her since their meeting. He was reporting her presence to someone. He described her as the Ranger, used her exact name, and asked whoever was listening how he should proceed now that she had seen more of the lower levels than protocol allowed. The voice on the other end was too distorted for Mara to make out clearly, but she heard one phrase distinctly before Holt lowered his voice further. The voice told him that containment was the priority, and that the Ranger was a secondary concern. Mara did not confront him that night. She lay awake until dawn, turning over every conversation they had shared, recognizing now the careful way he had steered her attention, the questions he had asked about what she had already told Crane, the subtle suggestions that she should wait before contacting anyone outside the facility. By morning she had decided that whatever Holt Bennett actually was, he was not an ally, and she could no longer assume she understood who else might be involved. She confronted him at midday, in the equipment bay near the stairwell, choosing the location deliberately because it gave her a clear path back toward the surface. Holt did not bother denying what she had overheard. He told her, with something almost like relief in his voice, that he had never actually left the program, that his role for the past several years had been monitoring exactly this kind of situation, civilians stumbling too close to the facility, and managing them before they became a larger problem. He told her the program had not survived this long by accident. Someone above the regional level, someone with real authority, had kept the funding flowing and the records buried for decades, because the substrate, whatever else it was, had proven useful in ways the government had never been willing to abandon. He did not say who that someone was, but he said it with a confidence that made clear he believed the chain of protection extended further than either of them could see from inside this mountain. Mara asked him directly whether Dale Crane was part of that chain. Holt's hesitation answered the question more clearly than any words could have. She did not wait for him to recover his composure. She drove her elbow into his throat, used the brief shock of the blow to wrestle the radio from his hand, and ran for the stairs before he could call for whatever backup he had been promising someone deeper in the mountain. She did not make it far. Alarms she had not known existed began sounding through the corridors, a low pulsing tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the emergency lighting along the ceiling shifted from white to a deep, steady red. Somewhere below her, she heard heavy doors releasing with a hiss of pressurized air, a sound she recognized immediately as containment doors opening rather than closing. She reached the equipment bay only to find the lower stairwell blocked by a section of corridor she had not explored, its far end now lit by a flickering red glow and filled with the same slow dragging sound she had heard on her first visit, now closer, now multiplied, as though more than one thing moved through the dark toward her at once. Mara forced herself to think rather than panic. She remembered the maintenance shed at her own ranger station, remembered every fire safety class she had ever taught to visiting school groups, and looked around the equipment bay with new eyes, no longer seeing rusted junk but seeing tools, fuel, wiring, anything that might become a weapon or a barrier in the hands of someone who refused to simply wait to be found. The first creature came around the corner of the corridor while she was still gathering what she could carry, a length of pipe in one hand and a cracked fire extinguisher in the other. It moved on limbs too long for its torso, its skin the same pale gray she had seen through the cell window days earlier, and its face, what remained of a face, still carried the unmistakable structure of a human jaw beneath skin that had stretched and thinned into something else entirely. It did not rush her immediately. It paused at the corner, head tilting in a motion that reminded her uncomfortably of a bird studying something it had not yet decided was prey, and in that pause Mara understood that whatever the substrate had done to these people, it had not erased everything that made them think. She backed toward the equipment shelves rather than the open corridor, putting solid metal at her spine, and raised the pipe in a grip she had learned years earlier in a self-defense class. She had taken more out of obligation than expectation of ever needing it. The creature came at her in a sudden burst of speed that closed the distance between them almost before she registered the movement, and she swung the pipe hard into the side of its skull, feeling the impact travel up through her arm with a force that surprised her as much as it clearly surprised the creature, which staggered sideways into the shelving with a sound between a shriek and a moan. She did not stay to see if the blow had been enough. She ran for the side passage Holt had shown her 2 days earlier, the hidden stairwell that did not appear on any structural map, hoping it led somewhere the alarms and the things they had released had not yet reached. Her shoulder ached from the impact of the swing, and a shallow gash along her forearm, earned when the creature's hand had caught her sleeve as she pulled away, had begun to bleed steadily down to her wrist. The hidden stairwell descended rather than rose, which was not the direction she wanted, but the corridor behind her had begun to fill with the dragging, shuffling sound of more than one pursuer, and she judged any direction away from that sound to be the better choice for the moment. She tied a strip torn from her shirt around the wound as she moved, tightening it with her teeth, a trick she had learned patching up hikers far more often than she had ever expected to use it on herself. At the bottom of the stairwell she found a heavy door, unlocked, and beyond it a room unlike anything else she had seen in the facility, walls lined with monitors exactly as Holt had described, all of them dark except for one, which displayed a live feed of a chamber far below, vast and dimly lit, where something pale and enormous pulsed slowly against the bare rock like a single vast organ breathing in the dark. A console beneath the monitors hummed with quiet power, and beside it, mounted in a glass case like a museum display, hung a single key card on a faded lanyard, exactly the kind Holt had told her would open the lower observation levels. Mara broke the glass without hesitation, ignoring the small cut it left across her knuckles, and pocketed the card. She found a working radio at the console as well, an older model but clearly maintained, and she used it to attempt contact with the outside world, broadcasting on every frequency she could cycle through, describing her location and the danger as clearly as her racing thoughts allowed. The response that finally came back was not the rescue she hoped for. It was Dale Crane's voice, calm and measured in a way that confirmed everything Holt had implied about him. Crane told her to stay where she was. He told her that a team was being assembled to handle the situation, and that her cooperation now would make things considerably easier for everyone involved, including her. He did not ask if she was safe. He did not ask if she was hurt. He asked only whether she had seen the source chamber yet, and something in the eagerness beneath his careful tone told Mara that whatever team he intended to send was not coming to rescue her at all. She switched off the radio rather than answer him and sat for a long moment in the dim light of the monitor room, forcing herself to think past the fear and the pain in her arm. She understood now that there was no rescue coming from above, that Crane and whoever stood behind him had every reason to want this contained quietly, and that quietly likely meant permanently, for her as much as for the creatures roaming the corridors above. That left her with two choices. She could try to find another way out of the mountain, some forgotten vent or maintenance shaft that might let her bypass both the creatures and whatever Team Crane intended to send, or she could go deeper, toward the source chamber the monitor displayed, and find whatever proof or weapon might exist that could change the balance of power before anyone arrived to finish what the Substrate project had started decades earlier. She thought of Soren Whitfield's boots sitting neatly beside his tent, and of Birch refusing to take one step closer to Site 7, and of every animal that had simply chosen to be somewhere else the moment the Substrate began doing whatever it had recently started doing again. She decided that running blind through unfamiliar tunnels with creatures behind her and a hostile team ahead of her gave worse odds than facing the source directly, on her own terms, with whatever advantage surprise and knowledge of the terrain might give her. The key card opened a service elevator hidden behind a panel near the monitor room, old but still functional, and it carried her down through nearly 200 feet of solid rock before grinding to a halt at a sublevel the building directory listed only as core access. The air here was warmer still, thick with a smell like wet copper, and the low pulsing tone of the alarm above had faded entirely, replaced by a deeper sound, almost a heartbeat, that she felt in her chest before she consciously registered hearing it with her ears. She moved carefully along a catwalk that ringed the edge of a vast chamber, the same chamber she had seen on the monitor, though seeing it directly was an entirely different experience than seeing it through a screen. The substrate filled most of the chamber floor, pale and glistening, rising in places into soft mounded ridges that shifted slowly even though nothing in the still air should have moved them. Thin tendrils extended from its surface toward openings in the chamber wall, openings that, she realized with a slow chill, connected directly to the cells she had seen upstairs. It was not simply a vein of strange organic material, as the old logbooks suggested. It was something closer to a single vast organism, and the people it had taken over the decades had not been consumed by it so much as connected to it, extensions of a will that had been patient enough to wait 50 years inside a mountain for the chance to grow beyond its original boundaries. A sound on the catwalk behind her spun her around before she had fully processed what she was looking at. Holt Bennett stood there, breathing hard, a fresh bruise darkening along his throat where she had struck him earlier, and behind him, filling the access corridor in a loose cluster, stood perhaps 6 of the pale, long-limbed creatures she had fought upstairs, standing rather than attacking, watching her with an unsettling patience that suggested they were waiting for some signal she could not see. Holt told her that the creatures would not harm her unless she tried to damage the chamber, that the substrate, as he called it, had no interest in killing what it might still use, and that her best chance now was to stop fighting and let the recovery team that was already descending the access elevator take her into custody rather than continue resisting toward an outcome that would only end one way. Mara looked past him at the creatures, really looked, and recognized in the shape of one face, twisted as it was, the bone structure of a young man whose photograph she had seen pinned to a missing persons flyer in town months earlier. She understood then that letting herself be taken meant becoming exactly what stood before her, patient and waiting in a corridor for the rest of her existence. She decided in that moment that she would rather die fighting than live as one more extension of the thing pulsing on the chamber floor. She did not run toward Holt. She ran toward the chamber's edge, toward a row of heavy industrial valves she had spotted along the catwalk railing, valves connected to pipes that fed, according to faded stenciling on the metal, a fuel reserve for the facility's old backup generators. She had no plan beyond instinct and the desperate logic of a ranger who had spent years thinking about how fire moved through dry forest, how quickly it could be made to spread once given fuel and air and a single source of ignition. Holt shouted something behind her, and the creatures finally moved, closing the distance along the catwalk with that same sudden burst of speed she had felt upstairs. But Mara had already reached the valves and was twisting them open as fast as her injured arm allowed, flooding the lower chamber floor with the smell of old diesel fuel pooling across the substrate's glistening surface. She had no matches, no lighter, nothing so simple, but she remembered the road flare clipped to her utility belt, standard equipment for any ranger who might need to signal a search plane or mark a hazard on a trail, and she tore it free, struck it against the catwalk railing, and threw it down into the pooling fuel just as the nearest creature's hand closed around her injured arm. The chamber erupted in a wash of orange light and heat that threw both Mara and the creature gripping her backward against the catwalk railing. She felt the metal at her back groan under the impact, felt the creature's grip loosen as it recoiled from the sudden blaze rolling across the chamber floor below, and she used the half-second of confusion to wrench her arm free and scramble away from the railing's edge. Fire alone, she understood even in the chaos of the moment, would not kill something that had survived buried in rock for 50 years, but it did something more immediately useful. It panicked the creatures, sent them scattering back along the catwalk and into the access corridor in a desperate retreat from the flame, and it gave Mara the one thing she desperately needed, a clear path toward the elevator that Holt and his recovery team had used to descend. Holt himself had been thrown clear by the blast, and he lay near the elevator doors clutching a leg bent at an angle that told her clearly enough he would not be chasing anyone for some time. She did not stop to help him, and she did not stop to finish him either, though some bitter part of her considered it. She simply stepped over him, called the elevator, and rode it upward through the smoke now beginning to rise through the shaft behind her. The elevator opened onto the monitor room level, and Mara emerged into a corridor now hazy with smoke drifting up from below, carrying with it the same chemical smell she had first noticed at the tunnel entrance weeks earlier, only stronger now, sharper, mixed with something that reminded her unpleasantly of burning hair. She did not have long before the people Crane had sent would realize their plan had gone wrong, and she intended to be far from this level before that happened. She made her way back toward the upper stairwell, the one that led, eventually, back to the equipment bay and the long tunnel toward the surface. But she found the path blocked by two figures in tactical gear who had clearly come down with Holt's team, now standing uncertain in the smoke, weapons raised but clearly unprepared for the chaos unfolding below them. Mara had no weapon beyond the pipe she had abandoned somewhere in the equipment bay and the bare desperation of someone who had decided, firmly, that she was not going to die in this mountain. She ducked into a side passage before either of them noticed her, circling through a service corridor that ran parallel to the main stairwell, trusting the layout Holt had shown her days earlier when he still believed she trusted him completely. The service corridor brought her out near the original equipment bay, but the bay itself had changed since her last visit, lit now by the same red emergency glow she had seen throughout the lower levels, and littered with signs that more than one fight had already happened here. A body in tactical gear lay near the base of the upper stairwell, throat torn open in a way that left no question about what had done it, and beyond him, in the stairwell itself, she could hear more of the dragging, shuffling sounds moving downward rather than up. She realized, with grim clarity, that the fire below had not simply panicked the creatures into retreat. It had driven them upward, toward the surface tunnel, toward the only other people currently inside the mountain, Crane's recovery team, who had clearly not expected to encounter 6 furious, fire-scared subjects of a 50-year-old experiment while securing what they likely believed would be a simple extraction. Mara waited in the shadow of the side passage until the sounds of struggle moved further up the stairwell, then climbed quickly behind them, using the chaos and noise of whatever was happening above to mask her own footsteps. She passed 2 more bodies on her way up, both in tactical gear, and felt no satisfaction at the sight, only a colder understanding that everyone involved in burying this place for decades had finally been forced to meet what they had been protecting. She reached the mouth of the tunnel just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern ridgeline, and the cold mountain air outside felt like the cleanest thing she had ever breathed. But she did not run for her cabin or for the nearest road. She turned instead and looked back at the dark opening behind her, thinking of the chamber far below still burning, of the creatures still loose somewhere in the tunnels, of Dale Crane sitting comfortably in his office in Anders Hollow, believing this would all be cleaned up quietly the way it apparently had been cleaned up before. She thought too of every name on every missing persons flyer she had ever passed in town, names she now suspected belonged to people who had simply asked the wrong questions or wandered too close to the wrong stretch of rock. She decided that quiet cleanup was not going to happen this time, not if she had any say in it, and she pulled the satellite messenger from her pack, the one device in her possession that did not run through any channel Dale Crane controlled. She sent a message not to her own regional office but directly to the state forensic investigators line posted on every ranger station bulletin board for exactly this kind of emergency, describing a mass casualty event at a hidden federal facility beneath Stormhaven Ridge, giving exact coordinates, and requesting immediate independent response from outside the local chain of command. She did not wait at the tunnel entrance for help to arrive. She used the pry bar still in her pack to wedge the heavy stone door as nearly shut as she could manage, buying whatever time the gesture might be worth, and then she retreated to a rise nearby where she could watch both the tunnel mouth and the trail leading down toward the access road, in case Crane sent anyone of his own before outside help could arrive. He did send someone. A single truck climbed the access road within 2 hours, well before any state response could reasonably have reached the area, and Mara recognized Crane's own vehicle even at a distance. She watched him approach the wedged door alone, watched him work at it with tools from his truck bed, and she understood that whatever he intended to do once inside, he believed he still had time to manage this quietly before anyone official arrived to ask harder questions. She did not confront him directly. She had already learned the cost of confronting people who had decades of practice hiding things. Instead, she used her radio, the same line he had used to summon his own team, and broadcast clearly enough that she knew it would reach any official scanner in range, describing exactly who was currently standing at the entrance to an unauthorized federal facility connected to multiple disappearances, and exactly what title he held in the Regional Park Service. The state response, when it finally came, arrived with considerably more force than Mara had expected, helicopters and vehicles filling the access road within the hour, and among the first people off the lead vehicle was a woman who introduced herself only as an investigator with a federal oversight office Mara had never heard mentioned in any briefing. She did not seem surprised by what Mara described. She seemed, if anything, like someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of opening. Dale Crane was taken into custody at the tunnel entrance without resistance, his earlier confidence having visibly drained out of him the moment the helicopters appeared overhead. Mara gave her full account to the investigator over the following hours, every detail she could remember, the logbooks, the substrate, Holt Bennett, the chamber, the fire. She did not know, in those first hours, how much of what she said would ever become public, and something in the investigator's careful, non-committal expression told her that some of it likely never would. A recovery team went into the mountain that afternoon, equipped far better than Mara had ever been, and what they found over the following days was reported to her only in fragments, secondhand, filtered through official channels that seemed determined to control the story even as they dismantled the place that had created it. Mara left Stormhaven Ridge for good 3 months later, transferring to a smaller station 2 states away where the mountains were lower and the forests held nothing buried beneath them but root systems and old stone. She heard, eventually and unofficially, that the facility had been sealed permanently, the chamber flooded with concrete, the substrates remained studied briefly by people whose clearance she would never reach and then, as far as anyone would tell her, destroyed entirely. She was never fully convinced that destroyed meant what the word should mean. She thought sometimes about Holt Bennett, who had survived the fire and was now, presumably, somewhere in a facility far better guarded than the one she had escaped, answering questions he likely still believed he could control. She thought about Soren Whitfield's boots sitting neatly by his tent, and about Birch refusing to walk one step closer to a hollow in the rock that his animal instincts had understood long before any human researcher cared to listen. Mostly, though, she thought about the simple fact that she had survived, that she had refused the choice the creatures and the chamber had offered her, and that she had walked out of that mountain on her own 2 feet rather than becoming one more patient extension of something that had waited 50 years in the dark for someone to finally let it grow. She kept the road flare clip from her old utility belt as a small, private reminder, and she made it a habit, in every new posting afterward, to listen carefully whenever the animals in a place suddenly decided, for no obvious reason, to be somewhere else.